December 20th, 1943. Over the frozen heart of Germany. A German fighter ace, Franz Stigler, pulls his Messerschmitt Bf 109 alongside a crippled American B-17 bomber. This is not a dogfight, it's an execution. Through the shattered plexiglass of the bomber, Stigler can see everything. He sees men, wounded, desperate, struggling just to keep the flying wreck airborne. He sees the tail gunner, slumped over his machine guns, clearly dead. The bomber's nose is shredded. Its fuselage is ripped open by cannon fire, exposing the crew to the freezing, high-altitude air. Stigler's fighter is untouched. His guns are fully armed. He's already an ace with 22 confirmed kills. One more, and he will earn the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. His finger rests on the trigger. He moves into position, just one burst away from glory. And in that moment, the entire war comes down to this one man. This single kill is everything. It's the one he needs for the Knight's Cross. It will make him a national hero. But as Stigler stares at the dying men in the flying wreck beside him, he does the unthinkable. He lifts his finger off the trigger. Instead of firing, Franz Stigler makes a decision that should have gotten him court-martialed and executed by his own government. He chose to save them. The question that would haunt both men for 40 years is, why? To understand the man who made that choice, we first have to understand who he was. Franz Stigler was not a secret pacifist. He was not a reluctant warrior. He was a professional fighter pilot, and one of Germany's best. Flying was in his blood. His father had been a pilot in World War I. By the time the Second World War began, Stigler was already an accomplished civilian pilot and a flight instructor for Lufthansa. When he joined the Luftwaffe, he quickly proved himself an expert. He flew hundreds of combat missions in North Africa, Sicily, and over Europe. He had been shot down multiple times himself and survived. He was a hardened ace, a man who understood combat intimately, and that is exactly what makes his decision so profound. This wasn't a man who hesitated to kill. This was a lethal hunter who, for the first time, chose mercy. But Stigler wasn't just taught how to fly and shoot. He was taught how to be a warrior. During his training, one of his commanding officers was a man named Gustav Rudol, an officer of the Old Guard. Rudol instilled in his pilots more than just tactics. He gave them a code. Stigler never forgot the lesson. Rudol told his men, "You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity." This wasn't some abstract philosophy. It had practical, ironclad rules. The most important? You never shoot an enemy who is defenseless. You never shoot a man in a parachute. To do so wasn't just dishonorable. It was to lose a piece of yourself. And it was this code, not the rule book of the Third Reich, that was running through Franz Stigler's mind as he prepared to fire. And this code of honor was in direct conflict with the brutal reality of late 1943. The air war had turned. Massive formations of American B-17s, flying fortresses, were hammering German cities day after day, bombing factories and homes. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin, desperate, and losing. The pressure on pilots like Stigler was unimaginable. They weren't just soldiers. They were the last line of defense for their homeland. Every bomber they failed to shoot down was a failure. Letting one escape was not just a missed opportunity, it was aiding the enemy. Now we shift perspective. Inside the bomber Stigler was hunting, a very different pilot sat at the controls. The aircraft was named Olde Pub. Her pilot was 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown. While Stigler was a veteran ace, Brown was a rookie. This wasn't just another mission for him. It was his first combat mission as an aircraft commander, responsible for the lives of his 9 crewmen. He was in command of a $300,000 flying fortress, but he was new to the war. He was about to fly head-on into the most heavily defended target in Germany, piloted by men like Franz Stigler. And for Brown, the mission went wrong from the very beginning. Their target was an aircraft factory in Bremen, one of the most heavily defended cities in the Third Reich. As the bomber stream approached the target, the sky erupted. First came the flak, thousands of black puffs of smoke, each one a high explosive shell designed to shred the bombers. Olde Pub was rocked violently by the concussions. Then the German fighters dove in. Hundreds of Bf-109s and Focke-Wulfs swarmed the formation, attacking head-on with cannons blazing. Olde Pub shuddered as multiple cannon shells found their mark. The No. 2 engine was hit, and then destroyed. The No. 4 engine was also damaged, leaking oil and threatening to catch fire. Inside, it was pure chaos. The electrical system was failing. The oxygen system was shot out, and at 27,000 feet, the crew began to suffer from hypoxia. Shrapnel filled the air. The plane was dying, and they were still deep inside enemy territory. Then it got worse. A direct cannon hit to the tail section killed Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode instantly, slumping him over his guns. In the main fuselage, multiple crew members were wounded by shrapnel, bleeding in the frigid, 60-degree air. With the oxygen system destroyed, they were all suffocating, struggling to stay conscious. The bomber itself was a flying sieve. The plexiglass nose was completely shattered, exposing the navigator and bombardier to the screaming, freezing wind. The tail section was so badly damaged it was barely attached to the rest of the plane. Ground crews would later find holes in the fuselage large enough for a man to crawl through. Olde Pub was no longer a flying fortress. It was a flying coffin. It had dropped its bombs and was now falling out of each formation, a 30-ton wreck descending from the sky. They were alone, defenseless, and hundreds of miles from safety. In the air war over Germany, falling out of formation was a death sentence. A lone bomber was a dead bomber. Olde Pub had fallen away from the protective combat box of the other B-17s. It was now limping along, far below its normal altitude, desperately trying to reach the North Sea. The crew knew what this meant. German fighters swarmed isolated, damaged aircraft like sharks circling prey. Olde Pub was nearly defenseless. Most of its guns were destroyed or frozen, and they had almost no ammunition left. They were a slow, crippled, perfect target, completely at the mercy of the next fighter that would inevitably find them. And at that exact moment, Franz Stigler was sitting on the tarmac of a nearby Luftwaffe airfield. He had just landed his fighter, after an earlier engagement, and was refueling and rearming. As he sat in his cockpit, his ground crew suddenly began shouting and pointing at the sky. There, crawling just above the treetops, was the lone B-17. It was a gift, an easy kill, delivered right to his doorstep. This was the one. This was the kill that would earn him the Knight's Cross. Stigler took off immediately. The hunter, fully armed, was now climbing to meet the hunted, who had nothing left. The two storylines were about to collide. Stigler's Bf-109 was faster, more agile, and fully armed. He closed in from behind, moving into the B-17's blind spot, perfectly positioned for the attack. He armed his cannons. This was it, the Knight's Cross. Standard procedure was to pull alongside, just briefly, to confirm the aircraft type, and choose a point of attack. Stigler did this. And then he froze. Through the massive, gaping holes in the bomber, he could see inside. He saw the crew, not as soldiers, but as dying men. He saw the tail gunner, slumped in a bloodied mess. He saw other crew members, wounded, trying to help each other, their faces etched with shock. He pulled his fighter level with the B-17's cockpit and looked in. He saw the young pilot, Charlie Brown, fighting the controls, his face a mask of terror and exhaustion. Their eyes met. In that instant, Stigler didn't see an enemy. He saw a man in a flying coffin, and Gustav Rudol's words echoed in his head. "You don't shoot a man in a parachute." These men were no different. They were as defenseless as someone hanging from a silk canopy. This wasn't combat. This was murder. Inside Olde Pub, the surviving crew was frozen in terror. The German fighter was sitting just off their wing, so close they could see the pilot's face. They braced for the end, waiting for the flash of cannon fire that would tear them apart. But the cannons never fired. Instead, the German pilot waved at them. He pointed down, toward Germany, then at his own plane. The message was clear. Land your aircraft. Surrender. Charlie Brown, gripping his controls, shook his head. He would not surrender. He kept the nose of the shattered bomber pointed toward the North Sea, toward home. Stigler saw the refusal. He nodded, as if he understood. And then he did the unthinkable. He didn't just spare them. He protected them. Stigler repositioned his fighter, moving into a protective escort position. He was deliberately flying in formation with them, shielding the B-17 from the German anti-aircraft batteries lining the coast. The gunners on the ground saw the bomber, but with a German fighter flying alongside, they held their fire, completely baffled. He escorted them all the way to the open water of the North Sea. His duty done, Stigler pulled in close one last time. He looked directly at Charlie Brown and brought his hand up in a crisp, formal military salute. Then he broke formation and turned for home. Charlie Brown and his crew watched the German fighter disappear. They were alone once more, but this time over the relative safety of the North Sea. They continued their desperate flight, the bomber groaning under the strain. Miraculously, the wreck of Olde Pub held together. They made it across the water and crash-landed at the first emergency airfield they saw in England. As the surviving crew climbed out, the ground crews stared in disbelief. They couldn't believe the aircraft had stayed in the air. The plane was so badly damaged, it was immediately scrapped for parts. It would never fly again. That night, Charlie Brown debriefed his crew. But he didn't just report the mission, he gave a strict order. Do not tell anyone about the German pilot, ever. The crew was safe, but a new mystery had begun. Why the secrecy? Brown feared that being spared by the enemy would be seen as treasonous, or that he'd be labeled a coward. Their survival was now a secret. Meanwhile, Franz Stigler landed back at his airfield. When he filed his post-mission report, he said nothing. He never mentioned the B-17 he intercepted, nor the salute. He simply reported that he had engaged the enemy and they had escaped into the clouds over the sea. He had to lie. What he had done wasn't just a breach of orders. Under the laws of the Third Reich, it was high treason. Aiding an enemy bomber, especially one that had just attacked a German city, was an act punishable by a firing squad. So just like Charlie Brown, Stigler was forced into silence. He kept the secret locked away. He continued to fly, fighting for his country for 2 more years, all while carrying the memory of an act that could cost him his life. The war ended. Franz Stigler survived, eventually immigrating to Canada in 1953, where he became a successful businessman. Charlie Brown survived, returned to the United States, and served a long career in the Air Force. But for more than 40 years, the encounter remained a shared, silent secret. Both men were alive, living on the same continent, completely unaware of the other. As Charlie Brown neared retirement, he found himself haunted by the memory. He had to know. Who was the pilot who had saluted him instead of killing him, and why? In 1986, he began a desperate search. He scoured archives and pilot associations across the globe, but found no answers. Finally, as a last resort, he placed an ad in a combat pilot newsletter detailing the encounter and asking one simple question: does anyone know who this pilot was? He had no idea if the man was even still alive. That newsletter made its way to Vancouver, Canada, and into the hands of Franz Stigler. He read the ad, and the past came rushing back. He picked up the phone and dialed the number. Charlie Brown answered, and Stigler's first words to him were simple: "I was the one." Brown was skeptical. He'd had calls from imposters before. He grilled the man on the phone, but Stigler answered every question, describing details only the two of them could have known: the damage, the salute, the exact location. In 1990, the two pilots agreed to meet in person. When Franz Stigler, now 75, walked into the room, Charlie Brown, 68, simply said, "My God." This was the emotional payoff to a 47-year mystery. Stigler finally explained his decision. He told Brown about Gustav Rudolph's Code of Honor. He explained the unwritten rule about not shooting a defenseless man, comparing the crippled B-17 to a man in a parachute. He had risked his own life, he explained, not for an enemy, but because he saw human beings in trouble. The man who could have been his killer was, in fact, his savior. That meeting wasn't an ending. It was a new beginning. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, the German hunter and the American prey, became inseparable friends. They spent the last 2 decades of their lives sharing their story, appearing together at air shows and veterans' reunions. Their bond transcended their old allegiances. Charlie Brown told interviewers that Franz Stigler was like a brother to him. Their story, which began in a moment of life and death, ended in a testament to friendship. In 2008, Franz Stigler passed away at the age of 92. Just 8 months later, Charlie Brown died, as if their shared journey was finally complete. When we look back at this story, we must also count the cost. Franz Stigler never got his Knight's Cross. The act of mercy that defined his life also cost him the highest military honor his nation could offer. He sacrificed fame, glory, and recognition, all for an act that would remain a secret for 40 years. In exchange for that secrecy, he risked a court-martial and a firing squad. He gained nothing tangible. He wasn't celebrated. He wasn't promoted. But in that moment, when he looked into the eyes of another man and chose mercy over duty, Franz Stigler kept something far more valuable. He kept his humanity. In the end, the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown isn't really about airplanes or the complex politics of World War II. It's about the moment those things became irrelevant. In the midst of total war, surrounded by orders, ideology, and a duty to kill, 2 men locked eyes through shattered glass. And in that instant, they didn't see an enemy, a uniform, or a flag. They saw a human being. Franz Stigler's choice had nothing to do with victory or defeat. It was a recognition of something more fundamental. It proves that even in the heart of our deadliest conflicts, a single act of compassion can defy orders, bridge divides, and affirm the one code that truly matters: our shared humanity.